Thank you so much, Ms. Gunderson. And now, after having started from the end, we get to start at the beginning. How do we ensure that the folks that are coming to law school and um, becoming lawyers and studying and training to become lawyers um, look like and understand and come from the communities that they serve. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor and Associate Dean Natalie Rodriguez. Um, she is the Associate Dean for Academic Innovation and Administration at Southwestern Law School. Prior to serving in this role, she was the Assistant Dean for Academic Success, and she helped build a comprehensive academic and bar support curriculum. She's been involved in various bar passage studies, including the California State Bar performance changes in the California bar exam and the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System, Building a Better Bar, Capturing Minimum Competence Study. She currently serves on the California Supreme Court Blue Ribbon Commission for the Future of the Bar Exam, and she is also the co-author of the forthcoming Volume 107 of Minnesota Law Review article, More Than Numbers, Empirical Evidence of an Innovative Approach to Admissions. I'd also like to introduce her colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Anderson. She is the founder and lead research consultant of Embraced Wisdom Resource Group, LLC, and she worked as the educational consultant for the IAALS Foundation's for Practice Learning Outcomes project. Her PhD is in research methods and statistics from the University of Denver, and she has specifically trained in psychometrics, the measure of development and non-traditional use of traditional measurement development techniques. She's currently serving on the ABA Outcomes and Assessments Committee, and of course, she's also a co-author of the forthcoming article in Volume 107. Please welcome Professor Rodriguez and Dr. Anderson.
Good morning, everyone. So we actually have a third co-author who couldn't be here today, but I want to make sure to mention our Vice Dean Anahid Garakanyan. So it is very fitting that we started with the end in mind and now working our way to how do we even begin and who gets to be in the room and who gets to become a lawyer. And so today we're going to talk about our project. We're going to talk about why it's important, why we embarked on this project, what we did. So we'll describe a little bit about the project, but it is in our paper if you want to read the details. And then we'll talk about what we're considering doing next now that we have completed the first phase. So access to the legal profession and legal education really does hinge on law school admission process, right? Who do we admit into law school? And despite the growing criticisms over the years, over 20 years now, law schools continue to be beholden to those traditional markers of who has merit, who gets to go to law school, specifically the undergraduate GPA and LSAT scores. And despite the criticism, there hasn't been much change. That's still typically how law schools assess who they admit into their school. Southwestern embarked on a first of its kind, methodical approach to trying something different, looking at metrics other than those numerical factors, largely based on the Foundations for Practice study, which Judith already described, so I won't go into those details. We came up with what approach can we take that takes more of a holistic evaluation of an applicant and that defines merit more broadly. The project really is driven by the moral imperative that law schools must do better. We serve as the gatekeepers into who becomes an attorney, who enters the legal profession. And for that reason, we have to consider innovative ways of making sure that that process is fair and inclusive. So before we go and dive into describing the project, I want to give you a little background of how we even got here today, because the project as it stands is quite different from where we started. But Southwestern started considering innovative ways of administering our admissions process going back to 2014. Between the periods of 2014 through 2017, we started using a waitlist interview as part of the process for applicants whose either undergraduate GPA or LSAT scores, those typical markers, maybe weren't exactly where we wanted them to be, but the applicant as a whole showed that there was potential there. And so we started administering these waitlist interviews. They weren't very methodical, mostly impressed. It was based on, we think this person has potential. We don't know how we define that, but we have a feeling that the student shows potential, or the applicant shows potential. Then we shift into 2018, where we started to using what we thought was a bit more methodical approach, in that we, two of our full-time faculty members, also vice deans, started using a specific prompt in these waitlist interview process. The prompt was, some college graduate school professors ban the use of laptops in their classrooms, i.e. the students must handwrite their notes. What are your thoughts about such a policy? Very simple prompt, but the prompt was designed to see if the student or the applicant had that intellectual curiosity. Could they understand that there were two sides to that simple question? Were they able to pay attention to detail? Did they understand what they were being asked? So again, it was these other factors that we were trying to assess in that simple prompt. What that prompt did for us is give us the initial validation that there was a way to methodically assess other factors that could not possibly be assessed under the current model of the LSAT. And so with that initial boost in confidence, we decided to embark in a much more methodical approach. And that's where our relationship with Dr. Anderson really began. So before I dive into the nuts and bolts of the project, I do also want to highlight two big takeaways that we have seen from the project. The first one is obvious, right? That it's really created a lot of opportunity for some applicants that would probably never get the opportunity to go to law school if we only admitted those who had the right LSAT score or the right undergraduate GPA. So it's resulted in about 9 to 23% of the entering classes from 2019 to the most recent 2022 to be comprised of matriculants who fit that category. That's a range of about 95 to 180 methodical interviews that we've completed. These matriculants whose applications showed promise but also raised some questions get to go on to law school and enter the profession and get a chance at becoming attorneys. The second is one that we did not at all anticipate or hypothesize, and it was the impact it had on these applicants' sense of belonging. We were very surprised by some of the comments we were receiving from applicants who went through the waitlist interview process, and they were telling us how just by going through that process, they felt heard, they felt seen, and they felt like they belonged in law school because somebody took the time to get to know them and were admitted into law school based on them as a whole applicant and not just their numbers. So with that, we can go ahead and start talking about the current project. So I'm not going to go again into the details of the Foundations for Practice. It's a great study, though. If you are not familiar with it, I would highly recommend that study. That's a study that came out in 2014. So many of us at Southwestern were already playing with the results from that study and how we could incorporate it into our own classrooms. At the time, I was teaching one of our first-year academic success courses, and I immediately grabbed onto that study and started implementing its findings into my own course, along with many other faculty members at Southwestern and I'm sure across the country. But it was that study that really fueled for us this idea. could we use those characteristics and competencies that we already recognize as being the same things that will help a student succeed in law school and then go on and succeed in their early years of practice? Can we use that as the foundation for what we assess in our admissions waitlist interview process? So these are the current foundations that we assess. I'll talk a little bit more about how we got here. This is not where we started, but this is what the current tool assesses. So let's talk about the process. The first thing we had to do was identify those foundations that we wanted to assess. As Judith mentioned, there were like a total of 77 that were identified as necessary in that first year of practice. We could not possibly assess 77 characteristics, competencies, and skills. So we had to figure out which of those did we think were most important for us to see in an applicant now at the starting stage, that would also not only lead to their success here at Southwestern, but ultimately in practice. Once, I think our initial set was 15. So we looked at the 77, we narrowed it down to 15, and for 2 years, that's what we assessed, 15. Now the list is much shorter, as you saw. We then had to define each foundation, and we had to focus on what exactly did we expect to see from an applicant as they came in and had this interview with us? What could we realistically expect for them to demonstrate during this interview process? So for example, we used resourcefulness as one of those that we have chosen to use, and we had to define it. So we defined resourcefulness as the ability to find timely and creative ways to handle tasks or resolve problems, deal skillfully and promptly with a variety of situations. So we had the foundation, and then we defined it for ourselves. Once we had that, we had to develop the questions that would elicit that response from a student. So if the applicant possessed that foundation, how could we ask, what kind of questions could we ask that would give them the opportunity to demonstrate that they had that foundation? We ultimately came up with 2 questions because the idea is we want to have these interviews be short enough that we could complete a number of them, but give the applicant enough opportunities that we could see if they had that foundation in them. So as an example, one of the questions we asked is describe a time that you had to set a goal for a large project over an extended amount of time. How did you prioritize and track the progress of tasks? How did you stay engaged, diligent, and overcome significant obstacles? So the question is short, but there's enough in there that we could assess, can they pay attention to detail, right? Like, are they listening? And of course, for these questions, we give the applicants time to pause and think about the question. We even give them the question, so they're not just listening to us ask the question, because we're not trying to trick the applicants. We really want to give them that opportunity to showcase these other things about them that make them great candidates despite their numerical indicators. We were also mindful that this approach we were taking could be quite subjective, right? We're moving away from a quantitative way of assessing a candidate to this qualitative manner of assessing. And so because we were mindful of the subjectivity that could come into the process, we wanted a way that we could assess the applicant against themselves versus comparing them to other applicants. So we came up with a baseline question that we used at the start of the interview process so that we could see in a very comfortable, non-law school related question, what was the applicant's body language, what level of detail did they use to answer the question. And so the question was as simple, what are your hobbies and or passion projects, right? That's something that anybody can answer, doesn't require looking into law schools or a specific law school, just a way to open up the conversation. And then we would use that to compare it to the other 2 questions that were part of the assessing the interview. Working.
Sometimes it just gets a little glitchy. I think if you go to
Okay.
let me see it.
There we go. Okay, and then the final step in the process, that's it. The final step in the process was making sure that we provided our interviewers with appropriate training. We wanted to make sure that the interviewers were all using the tool similarly, that they understood the questions, understood what the questions were intended to elicit, that they understood how the rubrics worked. And I will let Dr. Anderson talk a little bit more about the scientific research method behind our approach.
Thank you. Oh, I hate standing behind podiums because you can't see me because I'm short.
Would you like a handheld or a
Handheld is great. And I'm a mover and shaker, so I like to walk around. So we put this process together, specifically trying to make sure that we were meeting psychometric and empirical research design guidelines so that the specific data and evidence was being able to be collected for reliability and validity. But also, I was brought into this project as well as the Foundations for Practice project with IELTS because I really enjoy doing the statistics, which people don't like to do. But I like using those traditional statistics and psychometric methods in ways to be able to measure things that are more subjective and also to examine things like implicit bias. And so for this process, we put it in place this way so that we did have the evidence for content and context validity. That's really important in the paper. You'll see that yes, it's an extensive process. Yes, it takes a little bit more time, but it really ensures that you get the data and the pieces of evidence to be able to have the reliability and validity backing for the assessment being used and created. Also, using this process, I was on the back end using educational data and educational research to back up the definitions that were being written, the foundations that were being chosen, and looking around different industries and different fields of how these things were being measured in those areas as well. So to help have more of the empirical support.
And the slide makes it look like the process was very linear, right? Like we did step 1, then step 2, and we moved on. We circled back a number of times. With every admission cycle that we completed, we would come back together, we would elicit feedback from the interviewers, the interviewees, talking with Dr. Anderson about what she was seeing on the data side, and think through, are we doing this right? Is it really producing the kind of data that we expected to see? And where we need to make changes, we would make changes. So the current state of the tool, as we call it, is in its second year. We'd like to think maybe we finally have figured it out enough that we don't have to continue to change it. But I put that out there so that as other law schools consider engaging in a project like this, that they understand it's not just a time commitment as you're going through it, but you really are looking at a long view of refining it so that it works for your institution. So a little bit about, it's super working. A little bit about the training materials. All of this was designed in collaboration with Dr. Anderson, but we knew that we needed to take appropriate care on the training side of things. So we gave our interviewers, again, these are full-time faculty members, so we're not bringing like professional people in. These are people that have their full teaching load, but who either serve directly on an admissions project, admissions committee, or who just simply volunteered because they believe in the mission of what we're trying to accomplish with this project. So the interviewers were provided a couple of things. We have a Canvas page where we house all of the materials, but they were given examples of mock interviews, of the rubrics annotated with the kinds of notes we wanted to see from them. They were provided vignettes, which I will show in a second. But all of this was to have a methodical approach to conducting the interviews during the waitlist process. We also gave them a number of vignettes to practice with. And I'll show you an example of a vignette. But basically, it's giving them a real example of what they can expect during an interview process, like when they're sitting there and talking to an applicant. And so how do you use the questions and their responses to complete the rubrics? It was important to give them a number of these, and we also used these during a live training session with Dr. Anderson. So they had all of the materials that they could review ahead of time, and then during the 1 hour to an hour and a half training with Dr. Anderson, we would complete another one of these live to make sure that we were all calibrated and we all understood what we were doing during these interviews. So here's an example of a vignette, right? It has those types of information that you would typically see when you're talking to an applicant. We're all given ahead of time what was the applicant's LSAT score, their undergraduate GPA. So the process is not separate and apart from that. You have that information, but we don't stop there. We get to know the applicant and their responses to the questions. Really trying to design these to mirror the actual interview process as much as possible, though we were being methodical about the approach. So we have 8 to 10 faculty members who have, for the past few years, participated in these interviews. The interview itself is a half an hour, but for the interviewer, it's about an hour prep. So you take about 15 minutes or so ahead of time to review the applicant's file, 30 minutes for the interview, and then another 15 or 20 minutes or so to complete the survey that is gathering the information that they gathered from the interviewee. Do you want to talk about implicit bias?
Sure. So the training was designed really with 3 things in mind. So one, making sure that we were training all of the interviewers, all of the faculty that we're interviewing in a very consistent way so that they can consistently use the questions, but also consistently gather the data and the evidence from each of the applicants. But then also the vignettes that we use, I on the back end use those for inter-rater reliability to be able to check and see if there is a consistency in how the faculty interviewers are rating the applicants. So we have some wiggle room, but we don't have big discrepancies in how the rubric's being used. The last thing was that we did design the training to really focus in on implicit bias. Because of the things that are being measured and the foundations that were chosen, there were many loopholes in there for implicit bias to slip in and to wreak havoc in how applicants were being ranked and chosen. And we didn't want that. We wanted to make sure that that wasn't coming in and disrupting this amazing process of trying to give these applicants an opportunity to enter law school. And so we did some extensive training on what implicit bias was, how to identify implicit bias within yourself and as you're training. But then we also, as Dr. Rodriguez pointed out, have that baseline question about the hobbies. And so when the interviewers are using that baseline question, they're looking at how the applicant is responding, what's their level of enthusiasm, how completely do they answer the question, how many details do they give, their tone of voice, and then each applicant is only compared to themselves in the level of enthusiasm and completeness so that we can try and filter out some of that implicit bias. Also, on the back end, with all of the data that's being collected, I use a lot of measurement invariance techniques. So being able to see are certain applicant groups, either by race, gender, any of those demographic categories, and even we could look at undergraduate GPA and LSAT score and make sure that they are fairly being assessed using these interview questions.
So just to really bring that home, because we're using a lot of words that, I don't know, maybe I wasn't using before we started this project. So when we're talking about the baseline question and we ask an applicant, so what are your hobbies or your passion projects? You might have an applicant who gets very excited, demonstrably excited. They're smiling. There's a lot of body movement. They were like dying to have that question asked, right? And you might rate that person then high on the enthusiasm, and maybe they were also complete in their response. That's great, but now that's the standard you're applying to that applicant for the rest of the interview. You're not measuring them compared to anybody else. So if the second applicant comes in and they're not as bubbly, that doesn't make them less enthusiastic, and therefore that hurts their chances of getting into law school. That new standard is their standard, and they get measured only against themselves. And we ask the interviewers to provide evidence. So it's not like I get to just say this applicant was enthusiastic. We train them for how can they describe the evidence they use to make that judgment. So was there a lot of hand gestures? Did they lean in? Was there eye contact? Not because eye contact is the only way, but you're asked to describe what you're seeing, what you're assessing to make these determinations. So let's talk a little bit about the fun part, the numbers.
Oh yeah, so I talked about this a little bit already, but really the focus of this first part of the study was really around the content and the context validity and looking at reliability. And so from the first, I think this one's 2 years of data, we were able to get really good reliability. And because of the evidence and the data that we collected throughout the process, we have support for the validity as well. And then what we're working on currently is the inter-rater reliability, so making sure that interviewers are consistently using the tools that we're providing and the measures and the data that they are collecting and the evidence they're providing. And we're doing a lot of predictability models. So we're looking at how these rubric scores that are coming from this measure, how are they able to predict their success in law school? We also are looking at first-year matriculates that did not go through this waitlist process to those that did, to ensure that we have very small variability in their GPA and in their success in law school. So we're using all of that as well to help support the use of this process.
Now that we've had enough years of doing this this type of waitlist interview, we will start looking at bar pass rates soon as well to see is there anything that is there any correlation between what we're measuring and what we are defining as potential for success based on the waitlist interviews? Does that have any correlation with bar pass? So what Elizabeth described there, for me, nuts and bolts, is this is how we know it works, because I don't understand everything that she understands and does so well, but because she's able to look at the numbers and verify that, as she said, that there is validity and reliability, we know that this way of conducting waitlist interviews is working, and we're very excited about that and continuing to conduct these. So we want to leave you with what for me has had the most impact about all of this. And this is what the interviewers themselves or interviewees are saying. As a Mexican American woman, I know that injustices in the criminal justice system happen often, but I know law is a powerful tool to combat the inequalities faced by disadvantaged communities. So I applied to law school to be a voice for the underdog. Plus, my mom, who had me at 15, always told me you're not just a statistic and pushed me to explore uncharted waters. I've always been committed to challenging the status quo. Latinx folks deserve to be in these spaces of legal education and the legal profession.
And another quote. My waitlist interviewer dug deep and tried to understand me. She heard me, which was incredible. I knew law schools aren't comfortable taking a chance, but I was hoping some schools would want to hear my story. And that's what the waitlist interview did for me. This gave me the chance and confidence to pursue the dream that started with watching Fresh Prince of Bel-Air when I was a kid and thinking it's incredible to see Black attorneys and I want to be an attorney.
And finally, vulnerability was a big part of the application process, and it's scary for someone who's wanted to be an attorney since 7th grade to feel that the door to realizing your dream might be closed to you because of the LSAT score and the socioeconomic issues that impact the LSAT performance. I put a lot of trust into the school's review of my application. I didn't have the numbers and may have not been admitted, but for Southwestern's waitlist interview. But now that I'm in my last year of law school, top 30% in honors programs, and have done really well. So those are the people that are getting an opportunity to even get into the room and one day become members of our legal profession. Thank you. Are we taking questions now?
No, I think I have probably 3 questions.
Okay. We can take questions. So we can take questions now if you have any questions for us.
This was great, and I have so many questions, but if I could just pose 3. So it's great that you're reading out or trying to read out implicit biases, but I was wondering if the interviewers also know the GPA and LSAT of the applicant. And I guess there's a way to make sure that's not being factored in as well. Second question, is there room for intuition? Like I know you're into the data, but I'm also into intuition, like your sense, like somebody might be successful. I can't say why, but I want to support this person. And third, just going to metrics for success. I know you're tying it to bar passage eventually, but if students are bad at tests, I wonder if you're just measuring the wrong thing. So that's it.
Sure. I'll take the second question first. So yes, there is absolutely room for, you call it intuition, but other interviewers they have a gut feeling, whatever that might be. So there are 2 questions that are mandatory for every interview, and it's the 2 that we designed to measure the foundations. But because the interview is 30 minutes in length, there is still time to ask other questions. So if you have questions that you've used in the past that you feel give you good insight, you can use those questions. And on the survey that we asked the interviewers to complete, there's a section at the end for basically tell us anything else you'd like to tell us. And you're still giving a recommendation to whether admit or not admit the applicant. So yes, we're not discarding that, what we've learned over the years in interviewing applicants, but we are trying to add a level of being methodical because subjectivity can lead, even when you don't intend it to, some bad results as well. And then to your third question about, are we measuring the wrong thing?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's my jam. So actually for your first question, we are looking at measure and variance, like how applicants are being ranked. Can we identify them by their LSAT score or their undergrad GPA to ensure, because that's another little signal that there may be some implicit bias sneaking back in there. And again, we don't want that to happen. So those analyses are being done, and they are a regular part of our process. And then for your third question about measuring the wrong thing, law school is not unique in the educational world where nobody is able to have this perfect predictability model of what can predict success on standardized tests. I come from a K-12 background, so I worked a lot with those state testings and trying to predict both the proficiency but also the change over time. And we don't expect that we would see what we've found already is what we've already seen, is that the best predictor of the bar exam currently is the LSAT score. But we're trying to build out a predictability model around these results and around this data so that we could have a bigger model. So it may be what they got on the rubric scores for the waitlist interviews, but also their first year GPA and maybe their externship data. Like, we are combining it with a lot of other things to try and get bar exam predictability. So we understand that there's not just this golden ticket.
Yeah, and I think what I was asking is slightly different. Like, suppose we don't care about how students do on the bar exam.
Oh,
we care about whether they're successful as lawyers.
Yeah.
It might be like, obviously the people who aren't doing well on LSATs are bad at test.
Yes.
They might be bad at the bar exam, but it's not really getting at whether they would be good as lawyers. Also goes back to the, Judith Gunderson's presentation. Like, what are we asking the bar exam to do too much?
Oh, well, and I think from my experience with IELTS in helping them take those foundations and create those learning outcomes and really look at those as standards, I think that kind of was what they were trying to get at, is that there's these other things that are making lawyers successful in the field, and it's not necessarily just bar exams. So as on the other end, I work with IELTS more to develop how to measure those once you're in the field. Then we'll be able to have something else to compare it to. But as right now, we have the bar exam. We have a couple of different data points throughout law school that we're designating as law school success, of like what we would consider them to be successful in law school. And really the only summative assessment we have right now is the bar exam. But it's not the only thing we're using.
And in fact, it wasn't what we were thinking when we were looking to identify which foundations we wanted to assess. We were thinking, what is it that we've seen in our classes that we think leads to academic success and therefore professional success? Because we were already starting with the foundations report. Those are foundations necessary for success. That was our starting point. Adding in the bar data is just because now we're going to have it. We've been doing it long enough, so we should look and see, is there any connection there?
Is there a desire to expand this to the whole applicant pool or just the waitlist?
So currently, we're looking at the waitlist interviews only because of the amount of time these take. So as we created this tool, we were thinking about scalability. Can others replicate the process? But we're not at a place, can we at Southwestern make that part of our application process for everyone? It is rather time consuming.
But there are other ways, so.
Yeah, and we started talking about some of that, which is exciting.
So, I like those kinds of challenges. So I've started to present to Southwestern some other ways that you could use some of these similar techniques and these similar ways of assessing within the admissions process. So whether it's creating similar rubrics for other parts of your admissions process.
So for example, the personal statement, right? That's something that's part of every applicant's admission packet or materials. Can we create a rubric around that so that as folks are reading the personal statement, they're looking for ways to suss out, are we seeing those foundations that as an institution we find desirable and would like to see in an applicant? So that's one way of expanding it that doesn't require the interview, but right now that's in the ideas and next steps. But those are things that we're thinking about. I think we're out of time.
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank thank you all for those great questions, and thank you, Professor Rodriguez and Dr. Anderson, for sharing that with us. I'll try to be very brief, just introducing Dean Niedwicki. Dean Anthony Niedwicki is both the president and the dean of Mitchell Hamlin Law School. He's been an associate dean or a dean of law schools since 2010, and his scholarly research focuses on metacognition and the need to train law students to transfer their learning to new and novel situations. Dean Niedwicki also served as the city commissioner and a vice mayor of a city in South Florida, and he's very passionate about civil rights, and I imagine you'll see that in the coming presentation. Please welcome Dean Niedwicki.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's we do have time built in for lunch as well.
Well, good. It's nice to see everybody, and it's nice to come across town and partner with another law school here. You guys are all doing some really, really great work here, and I just want to emphasize how great Josh has been through this process. He's a great representative of the law school, so you should all be really, really proud of this program that he put together today. I think the program is really very, very timely because I think we saw a lot of the issues that I'll talk about a little bit today through the pandemic. The pandemic showed us that law schools and legal education, legal profession can actually make change. And we also saw through this last few years a lot of things locally that showed us that law schools have to play a bigger role in making changes in our society on some of these really difficult issues. I happened to start my job at Mitchell Hamlin July 1st, 2020. So in the middle of the pandemic, right after George Floyd was murdered. And so that really gave me a lot of focus about the type of work I needed to do as president and dean at Mitchell Hamlin. I also was very lucky to come to a school that really emphasized access and opportunity, making sure that they were providing legal education for their history to people that otherwise would not be able to get a legal education. That goes back to their founding all the way to the time when they started. They were a part-time program that were open to people that at that time there wasn't part-time programs. It's still the only part-time program in the state of Minnesota. And so that's really a big emphasis of our school. Our school has also really pushed innovation and trying to be the forefront of a lot of different types of issues that we do, legal education and legal profession. And so we were the first school to have a hybrid program that was ABA approved. And so we still are leading in that way, again, tied to this idea of access and opportunity. That program was designed to really kind of open up access to legal education to people all over Minnesota, rural Minnesota, people that needed to go part-time but couldn't go to any of the other schools while they were here. Talking to some of the justices of the Supreme Court here in Minnesota, one of the biggest issues they have right now is finding lawyers in outstate Minnesota. And so having a program like we do at our school opens that type of legal education to others. And so that's the focus we really want to talk about today, is how do we open up legal education to those that aren't otherwise have the ability to go to law school. And one of the big programs that I wanted to talk about is really kind of pipeline programs. Many schools talk about pipeline programs and what that means. The LSAC is actually exploring pipeline programs with universities and able to get people that were earlier in undergraduate education, get them interested in law school and then going on to law school successfully. We have a couple different types of pipeline programs at our school that we've started over the last couple of years. One of those is what we call our Gateway to Legal Education program. It first started as a program that was designed to connect with historically black colleges and universities. And what our school does is we teach a course in their undergraduate program from some of our professors at our school in order to gauge interest, get them interested in law school, and it's really designed for people that are from underrepresented groups. And so we've been doing that. That really hasn't necessarily played out in increasing the diversity of our school. It's actually increased diversity at other schools, but not at our school. And so we've now taken that program and looked at how can we use that program here locally in the state of Minnesota. And so what we're doing and what we see, and this is an area of untapped, I think, potential for law schools. We are now trying to do pipeline programs with 2-year colleges. Here in Minnesota, the 2-year colleges, the community colleges, are the most diverse schools, diverse colleges in the state. And nobody's going to them and trying to get them interested in what law school is and what law school could do for them. These are often people from underrepresented communities. They're often very first-generation students, but they also come from places that have low economic status and so forth, and probably don't think law school is a possibility for them. And so that's why we ventured into this area this past year. And we started partnering with North Hennepin Community College with a program where some of our professors and some of their professors are teaching a course on race, psychology, and the law. And so it's getting those students interested in law school, and we're doing a gap type of program, so when they finish their 2-year program, that they can go on and get their undergraduate degree and then move into law school. Because we have a relationship with Hamlin, that's going to be our gap school as well as Metro State. The goal here is really to try to get them prepared and interested in law school and thinking about law school, but because they're coming from 2-year colleges and have not really thought about this, we have to really think about how do we think about the cost. This is always one of the barriers, I think, a big barrier to legal education. I really wanted to start today by just highlighting one of our problems, and that's the diversity in our profession. So we have seen great diversity in law schools. I think even here at the University of Minnesota, they saw one of the most diverse groups of students start this fall. So we've seen that happen over the last couple decades here in legal education. We have not seen the exact same thing happen after legal education into the legal profession. We don't see the same corresponding increase in diversity there. So we've got to figure out what are those barriers to that happening. And I think one of those is cost. And so we've got to think about differently about how we actually give scholarships to students. Right now, schools are really focused on U.S. News and World Report rankings, and the way that they increase their rankings is by giving discount or scholarships to students with high LSAT scores. I love the presentation that preceded this and talking about other factors that go into legal education or in decisions for admissions. And I think that we all should be thinking about that, how we can actually open up the gates to legal education to others that might not have otherwise been able to go. And so what Southwestern is doing is really, really a great step that way. But we also have to figure out what kind of cost is that barrier. And so what we're doing in legal education and generally, we're giving scholarships to those people who did well on the LSAT exam. And those students, that group of students, aren't always the ones that need that type of scholarship. And so those that have lower LSAT scores are getting less scholarships, so they're paying more tuition, and that ends up financing those that probably don't need that type of money for scholarships. And so we need to think differently about putting our money towards financing those students who have actual need. And so that's been a big, really important goal of mine at my school, is to figure out how do we raise money to give need-based scholarships to students that otherwise wouldn't have the types of money. Because I just don't think if we're going to be honest, we're not really doing the things that we're saying we want to do. We're not walking the talk when we're saying that we really want to fix legal education and make it accessible, but we're doing it on the backs of those that are least likely to be able to afford law school. And I just think we have to think differently about that, and that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about as well. The other thing is, we know that there's particular areas in our practice of law where there isn't a lot of diversity. And at my school, one of the things we focus in on is patent law and IP law, where there's really a lack of diversity, both racially and gender-based. I was a math major in undergrad, so I was a nerd, but I went and sat in classes with engineer students and science students, and it was all men, all white men. And so I know that this has been historical, and so we have to think about how do we actually change the patent field, which engineering students lead into that. And so we've tried to think a little bit differently. So we have another pipeline program we've started recently, and that's a pipeline program where we partner with a local law firm, and we're actually even partnering with the Association of American Intellectual Property Association, that's what it is, with them as well, in order to help them find diversity within their practices. And so what they do is they start with us through some of the pipeline programs and do these courses at these other schools, at these 2-year colleges or HBCUs, or schools with STEM programs. and we're mentoring those students early with this law firm. And then the law firm is helping us to admit and find students that we would admit to law school that would fit their goals, with the idea that they would also be the ones that would hire these folks when they would graduate. And so there's that real incentive for the students to go into this program because they see, hey, if I go through this program, I'm going to have a job when I leave. And so you do this in partnership with each other. And so the lawyers at the firm will mentor the students before, during, and after law school. So they've set up these mentoring programs for them. We actually pay for LSAT prep courses for them as well, and we do give them a scholarship there. And then the law firm and the school, we share a scholarship, so the students almost get a full scholarship to go. So we pay 50%, they pay 50% for them. Then we also pay for the patent bar prep and patent bar exam as well. And so they do internships and externships with the law firm during law school, so they're getting the experience that they need. And then when they leave, the goal is that they would actually be hired by the law firm that partnered with us. So we're trying that with the patent area right now in a local law firm, and we're hoping to expand that to other areas of specialty at our school, like our Health Law Institute and Dispute Resolution Institute, which are our two big programs at the school. But the one I really my passion project I like to talk about a lot is the other pipeline that we kind of broke ground with this year, and this is our pipeline, our prison to law pipeline program. For the very first time in the history of the United States, 2 currently incarcerated individuals have begun a legal education at Mitchell-Hamlin. We did this in partnership with All Square over the last year. It's a wonderful start to a program. It's been a little difficult getting started, but we have 2 students that are in the program at this point. So let me just kind of go through and give you a little bit of idea of how that started and where it is at this point, because I think it's really important for us to not be the first school to do this, but to be one of many schools eventually that do these types of programs. This program started with, like I said, in partnership with All Square, which is a local company here that employs people that are recently released from prison, and it's a grilled cheese sandwich place. And I guess I've never been there, but they're supposed to have the best grilled cheese around, so make sure you go and see them. But we have a reentry clinic at our school that is designed to help people that leave prison with their legal issues that they might have. And so we've been working with All Square through our reentry clinic. And then during the pandemic, we started to see, there are ways that legal education can be delivered differently and can be done well. And we've seen that done at our school. And because we are the leader in hybrid legal education, we thought this might be a good way for us to maybe break in and do something differently. So I met with our reentry clinic. I met with the folks at All Square to talk about this. And the first question I asked is, I said, have they been able to take the LSAT exam? And they weren't, because at that time, there was the LSAT Flex, which was the online version of the LSAT exam. And so they weren't able to get through the firewall that was at the prison system. And so I said, well, let me talk to LSAC and see if we can do something differently. So I contacted LSAC, and they were wonderful. And so we decided that I would actually go and administer a paper exam at the prisons here for a couple of the folks. So I went to Shakopee Prison a year and a half ago and administered the LSAT exam, and I went to Stillwater Prison as well and administered the exam there. It was a wonderful and very eye-opening experience. If you have any idea about the 2 prisons, they're about the exact opposite types of prisons as you can imagine. Shakopee looks like a campus, and it's very, very casual. It looks like a school when you walk in. They've got a great learning center, and then you've got Stillwater, which you would picture a prison to look like. You walk in, and they didn't have a classroom where they took me to do the exam. We did it where the lawyers meet with their clients. It was a little more chaotic. It was a little bit crazier there, but it was a really, really interesting experience. One of the things that was most memorable to me in that experience was at the very end. I talked to the applicant that was at Stillwater. He said, I do all kinds of legal work. I actually won a case for myself, a motion for myself, and I do a lot of legal work. I don't understand how this test I just took ties to what I do in legal work. And so it was a really good, discussion about how are those things tied together, and really what the importance of law school is and how that will help him become even a better lawyer. And so that was a really great experience. And so after that, All Square has actually been working with, and the role that All Square plays is they identify applicants throughout the system that would actually want to go to law school. And they're the first kind of wall or review of our students that would come through. And then they recommend students to apply, and they help them go through the application process at the school. After I went to Stillwater and Shakopee, and there were some news stories done about this because it was probably one of the very first times that anybody administered the LSAT exam within a prison. You wouldn't believe the amount of emails, phone calls, handwritten letters that I got from people that are currently incarcerated. It really showed the desire and the need that there is for people in these types of programs. I was really moved by a person who called me and talked to me from a prison in Tennessee, who at this point had already received his bachelor's degree in prison, master's degree in prison, and a PhD in prison, and now wanted to go to law school and wanted to figure out how we can do that there. He said, I've already talked to my warden, we already have Zoom, we have all these things in place. It showed me that, this is something that can actually be able to grow and go beyond Minnesota. What was really good and about the ability you hear in Minnesota is that we have a great commissioner of prisons, and Paul Schnell, and he's been a wonderful partner in doing this. And so we wouldn't have been able to do this program without his support and without the support of the administration that we currently have. But what was always really important to me, and what I try to keep telling people about why this program is important, there's two reasons. Number one, we should always be trying to give the skills to the people that are most affected by the legal system. And that's what we're trying to do. So those most affected should be able to get the skills to be able to do things well. They're already practicing law. Why not give them the tools to be able to do it well? Put them in the best position possible to be able to do that. The second thing is, we know the recidivism rate of those that are incarcerated goes down with each type of educational experience that they have. So if you get a high school degree, a study from Emory University showed those that get a GED or a high school degree while they're incarcerated, the recidivism rate goes less than 54.6%. That's still high, but then you go, those who get an associate degree, it goes down to 13.7%. Those who get a bachelor's degree reoffend only 5.6%. Those who have a master's, it's 0%. Study after study has shown that. And so with a law degree, can you imagine what that would do in order to make sure that we're doing the best that we can for those that leave prison, giving them the best skills that they could possibly have in order to be able to make their lives the best that they can. And so as we went through planning and trying to think through this, at Mitchell-Hamlin, we have two types of programs, two enrollment options. The first enrollment option that we have is our on-campus program, which is very traditional, similar to what you guys have here. We have a part-time online program, part-time on-campus program. We call it BAM, bricks and mortar. I never knew what that meant until I interviewed. So we have BAM program, and then we have our blended program, which is our hybrid program, where our students come on campus at the first week of the semester, at the beginning of the semester for a week, and at the end of the semester for a week for the first couple years. And then they continue on with online and partially hybrid courses throughout their term. And so my thinking was going into this that these students would want to be part of our blended program because that's what we've been doing for so many years. So we had a planning session with the Commissioner of Corrections, the folks at All Square, and the folks at my school. And it was interesting that what the commissioner wanted to have was very different than what we wanted to have. And it really kind of highlighted how the importance of coordination between the different entities had to be. The commissioner, I'm thinking we're going in with a blended program. He wants us to do something with the regular daytime program. And so, and that just changed our thinking a little bit. He wanted to do that for a couple reasons. Number one, he wanted to make sure that those students had as close of an experience and as much interaction with students as possible in order to get the best experience. And the second thing was it helped with security within the prison. And so they already had programs with the University of Minnesota as one of them, and other schools, where the students were taking classes during the day. And so if we were able to offer these courses to these students during the day through Zoom online, then they could be in the same room with those that were taking other courses at other schools within the area. And so that's what we decided to do, is to go through our on-campus program with them coming in and doing this high flex model where they would be on Zoom and the students in the class would be in the classroom. We had bought all kinds of technology at the school to make this work because we knew that through COVID and all that stuff, we needed to have the ability to do a lot of high flex at the school because that's just the nature, I think, our future going forward in legal education. We're going to have times when students aren't going to be able to be in class, and there's going to be times when they're going to be in class, whether it's because they're sick or they've been exposed or some other reason. So we wanted to build that flexibility into our program. And so that's what we've done. So those students that started this fall, that's the program that we went through. So our goal was really to go after two different types of students, and this may surprise some people when we think about this program. The first type of student is those that want to go out when they leave and actually do some type of legal work. They may not be able to practice law because we don't ever make any promises to our students that they're going to be able to practice law because we don't know if they'll be able to get through character and fitness, and I'll talk about how we're overcoming that. But the second student that we thought is really important to reach too are those that are maybe in prison for life, because we think that education for anybody is important. And again, it's important for them to take ownership and control and have agency over their own lives when they can. And so giving them the skills to do that. And so we didn't differentiate between who we wanted to have in the program, whether they were going to be people that are leaving soon or people that might be in prison for the rest of their lives. We thought education and the sake of education is enough for us to go forward with this. And so, like I said, we partner with AllSquare. AllSquare has been a great partner with us. They were the ones that done fundraising to help pay for the tuition for the students. They've helped us pick students to apply. They facilitated some of the issues we've had between the students and the school. But they've also thought a little bit more broadly about what they're going to do. They've come up with this idea of a legal revolution, and one of your graduates right over here, John, is the co-founder of that, and we've been able to partner with him in order to think bigger. And so what they're doing is they're going to come up with, and they're starting a law firm, and I think they just recently did this, for these people that leave this particular program and go on and practice law. They are going to have attorneys there that are licensed that can then supervise their work and sign off on their work so they can actually do work. But the law firms are really going to be designed at making changes and challenging the system that got them in the first place. And so it's a really good overall thinking of this program. And so the folks at AllSquare have really had a great vision and design and thinking about how this is playing out. We also had two other big issues we had to overcome first. We had to get ABA approval because we would have actually students who would be fully online, and ABA rules do not allow that. And the second thing, we had to make sure our faculty had to approve it. And so those things weren't always going to be slam dunks. In our faculty, there were a lot of discussions. There were concerns about, are we spending too much time thinking about only a couple students? Are we doing the right thing? What about the victims of the family? And those discussions were great because it really made us think a lot more about what the program should look like. And so because of those, we came up with ways that we would then partner with the Department of Corrections on any restorative work in notifying the families of victims of the folks that would go through the program, so they would be aware of this. So we thought that that was important it was really kind of important for us to get through our faculty because that was a concern of our faculty. So that's played out a little bit for us. The ABA, it really didn't take as much as I thought. We had to do the variance and the acquiescence, which is a lot of work, and you can't always predict what 30-something people on a council are going to do, but they approved it in May and allowed us to have 2 new students enroll every fall. And so we had our first 2 students enrolled this fall. They applied through the normal process of the law school. They had the same LSAT scores, the same predictability of success in law school as all of the rest of our students would have to do. They went through the faculty process, were reviewed by the faculty, and then offered admissions. So we had 2 students this year. We've had a number of other students through AllSquare that have actually taken the LSAT exam and thought about going to law school somewhere in the future. And so there's already a pipeline built up for that. So let's talk a little bit about how it played out. Well, that was the interesting part. because all these dreams and all these ideas, they sound really good, but when you actually, put the rubber to the road, how does it work out? So everything was going really well. We started classes in August, like other law schools. The week before law school started, all of a sudden, the people that are working at the two particular prisons, we were working with Stillwater and Shakopee, found that there were some difficulties, that they didn't have the computer system that they needed to do. So they had to figure out, how are we going to get the computer system that has less security on it? Because what's different about our program and what we are trying to do here than any other program in the country is that they would actually be interacting with students in a classroom. And so most prison programs right now are programs where it's either asynchronous or it's done within the prison with only the prison folks. This is one of the first programs in any educational level where there's actually something where the students are interacting with those that are in the classroom. We thought that that was really important, both for our students at the school, but also for the students that were taking this from Shakopee or Stillwater. And so that caused particular issues and a little bit of heartburn, I think, for some people that were at the facilities themselves. And so there were some regulations that some of the people at some of the prisons thought prevented them from doing certain things. So that week before school started, we weren't sure we were actually going to be able to do the program because we didn't know if they were going to be able to have the people online. Because one of the problems was that you had one person in Shakopee, one person in Stillwater, and for some reason there's a rule there that those people that are in different prisons cannot talk with each other. And so that was the issue. It wasn't about the student talking with the students in the class, it was people talking with each other across different facilities. And so we had to think through that a lot, and that's again where folks like John and All Square and us helped a lot in facilitating and try to come up with some ways around this. We ultimately, this is where the commissioner became very helpful. Probably people at the prisons don't like me very much anymore, but the commissioner is great because it's like sometimes you just have to call the right people and they're going to say, okay, we'll fix it. But the very first week, we got everything through. But they still were hesitant about letting the two students who were online show their faces online because they didn't want to make sure there was some type of community. I didn't understand it. So the faces I see in the audience was the same face I had when I was told that this was an issue. And so I talked to the commissioner, and the commissioner said, that's not what we said. So let me work on this. A few days later, it went through and they were able to show themselves online. In some ways, I look back and I think maybe that wasn't such a bad thing because the students got to know these folks without having to even think about any of their internal biases about seeing somebody that would be in prison in their classroom. And so they got to know them and they got to interact with them through not seeing their faces on Zoom, but their voices they could hear. And so I think that a lot of connections happened in those classrooms because the day that they were actually able to show their face on Zoom, the class applauded because they were so excited about seeing them. I get a little teary-eyed when I think about that because that to me just shows we were able to do what we wanted to do, We affected people. And so that's why I think so highly about this program and what All Square is doing and the things that we're able to do. Like I said, and how I started this, I know we're the first in the country. I don't want to be the last. I think this is going well now. The students are doing well. They're participating very well in the classroom. I think one of my favorite stories I've heard from one of my professors is the criminal law class, where I think this is a really, really helpful perspective for the students to hear. When the professor said, well, let's just ask the question. Do we think that there should be prisons and should people be incarcerated? And he went to the one student in the class, her name's Mo. You've probably read stories about her. Said, Mo, what do you think? She goes, hell yes. I think they need to be in prison. There's certain people that need to be in prison. And I think that just kind of dispelled what people were going to think that they were going to say in the classroom. And I think it broke down some walls on the discussion about what is the purpose of incarceration, what role should it play, and how should that work. And that wouldn't have happened if you didn't have somebody who's actually speaking to the class with a perspective of being in a justice system, and so and being incarcerated. And so the program's worked very well. Our students have been amazing through this process and have really, really loved it. And I feel like they've gotten a lot out of it. And I'm so glad that we've been able to do this. I've got a group of professors that have taught this class with these students and have been great. So I'm just glad that we're doing this. And again, hopefully this is something University of Minnesota will do. Hopefully this is something University of Tennessee will do. Hopefully this is something that we'll see happen down in Texas at some of those schools that I've spoken to about this. So with that, I will take any questions about any of these pipeline programs that you'd like to talk about. Yes.
Francesco Parisi, I teach here. Beautiful presentation. I emotionally would like to volunteer. But I have a question. We do a lot of scrutiny when we are on admissions about character, fitness, and other things. And we flag students who have a criminal record. And how do we transition from one to the other? Somebody who has been in prison is discriminated against, somebody who is in prison is invited in. Second question is, bar admission, somebody who has a criminal record is usually barred. And how do we allow then somebody who is actively in prison to be admitted to the bar?
Yeah, well, I'll answer the second one first. We make sure that the students know that we can't guarantee admissions to the bar for these folks at all, that we don't know what the state bars are going to do. But going back to the first question, this has actually made people think differently about character and fitness. So one of my projects when I was in California, and I sat on one of the law school councils for the state bar there were studies done at Stanford that showed, people that have left prison may have committed a felony of some sort, spent time in prison, and left. When they're out of prison for 5 or 6 years and have not offended, they have the same rate of committing crimes as those that have never committed a single crime. So what is the purpose of having that character and fitness test there for those that may not have, there's no danger whatsoever? And so having our faculty is really kind of thinking through, maybe we should think about character and fitness a little bit differently. Maybe we shouldn't be having bars of students not being able to get into law school because we think that they're not going to become members of the state bar. And so I think it's going to be an educational process for state bars, for state Supreme Courts across the country as we go through a process like this to show that it's important to have these folks who have been so touched by whether they've done crimes and serve prison and then go to law school, or whether they're going to law school while they're in prison, but what value they bring to the legal profession. It's like those that are most affected are going to have a different perspective and a different motivation, and we've got to do what we can to make sure that they're part of the system and challenging the system in a way that we know is broken. I mean, we don't want to ever say that, but there's a lot of things that are wrong within our current criminal justice system. And those people are going to be able to come through and say, this is what happened to me. This is why I think there's this injustice. Or I think I was properly, charged and I was convicted, but I've changed my life and this is what I want to do and I'm driven to do this. Why would we want to bar those folks from having some say and some involvement in our system? And so that's kind of, I think, helped with our faculty. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it. I think there's a lot of work to do. But these two students, that's their mission, is to change the way that the world thinks about those that are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. That they can be very productive members of society, members of our profession, and those that can actually challenge and make significant, long-lasting changes to our justice system. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, this sounds great. Are you also doing anything to change how the state thinks about character and fitness?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to. I mean, if that's going to be part of it. So I have had conversations with Supreme Court justices and more on the personal side of that, just to kind of open these issues up. I think part of it is really just interfacing with them. We had, at the grand opening of this event, we had a couple of Supreme Court justices go to it, which I think is pretty amazing that the state thinks differently and wants to think differently about this stuff. Can't say that all of them are that way, but I think that this opens up their mind and where they are as it relates to character and fitness in those that have served some time. Yeah.
Are you screening out violent criminals versus others or not?
There's no line for anything. It's up to the faculty. It's up to the faculty about whether or not they're going to show they have good reasons about why they want to get this degree and how they want to use it. And so I stay out of the process. As Nadine, I'm sure Gary would tell you, anything that deals with admissions, that's faculty territory, so we leave it up to the faculty. But there's no bright line or anything like that. All Square does some screening to make sure they're bringing forward people that they think are the ones that are actually going to want to do change, that are going to be willing to do the hard work. Law school's hard. And so one of the other things that was really important for us to think about here, and All Square has done a great job of this, is thinking through all the extra support that they need that's different than what our students need. Just think about all the support we provide our students on a daily basis, whether it's emotional support, whether it's academic support, whether it's bar prep support, whatever it is. There's a whole different level of isolation that these students feel that they have to go through and deal with. There might be certain things that they have to face through learning about the law, about themselves. And we have to make sure that we have partners, psychologists and counselors, and that's what All Square set up to help with those particular things, to make sure that they're successful. And so providing those types of support was really important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.